Hi, my name is Ronnie Guinnessar, and I'm here to talk to you about creating intuitive catalogs for variable fonts, specifically creating new selection tools for fonts. Given the new features that variable fonts introduce to the font file, the question is, should the display of the font and the interaction with it change as well? Let's start from the beginning. Variable fonts, officially known as open-type font variations, were introduced back in 2017 by big tech companies with the intent to speed up the web. Instead of a separate font file for each typographic variant, for example, bold versus regular, we can now have a single font file that has both. Each time we access the file, we request a different value for the instance. Less font files means less loading time for websites, and thus our phones are faster. Alongside the practical aspect, a powerful design tool is born, not only for type designers, but also for graphic designers, the users of fonts. Now we can customize the font according to our specific needs, from within the scope that was defined by the type designer. Given that now that the font is defined within a space, we need intuitive navigation tools to accompany them. We would want to be able to explore the space and to reach the full range of options. So why research this tech? History is full of technologies that were shelved due to bad user experience. Take the video conferences that are now relevant more than ever, introduced in 1964 by AT&T as the picture phone booth. The problem is that in practice, we want to present endless options while maintaining intuitive interaction and a smooth design experience without visual overload. So, how can we make such a catalog? This question was the center of research that I conducted at the Design Hybrids Lab at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem under the guidance of Dr. Mitzoran. At the lab, we researched making digital technologies accessible to craftspeople by tool making, from chefs to ceramic creators to graphic designers, combining practices from computer science, cognitive science, human-computer interaction, and design. What we'll talk about today is the interactive specimen we developed, replacing abstract design decisions with a given set of visual options to select from and to react to. This was joint research with the Bezalel Academy of Arts under the guidance of Kobe Levy. We'll go over the process, where we can improve, and what we got right. So, type specimens. Basically, since the movable type revolution, the font catalog barely changed its appearance. A printed catalog with different sizes and weights and styles. With the shift to the World Wide Web, sliders joined in the specimens mainly to control sizes. And in our daily font interaction, we usually select from a drop-down menu. When we arrive at variable type specimens with the new abstract feature of variable fonts, we still mainly use sliders, namely a slider for each axis. The only problem is that this gives us a lot of choice, and as humans, when we have too many options, we usually refrain altogether from selecting, in what is called the paradox of choice. So we play around with all the sliders and all the options, and then say cool, and close the site and use one of our regular fonts. But what if we presented things differently? Practices that are already employed for displaying fonts, but making tools with them. For example, visually mapping the data and keeping in mind the multiple dimensions. Namely, using visual presentation that we already use in our workflow. Let's say color selection. We visually select from options, and then we can fine-tune our selection. We can just also go ahead and type in what we intended if we know the instance in advance. We, as the user, the designer, we have the control. With this in mind, we set off to recreate the same concept as a working tool for selecting a variable font instance, keeping the basic tools needed for font selection. A hybrid of the mapping options that we saw with the concept of visual selection, along with design practices and needs. So, the process. We started off by diving into visual selection research in psychology, economy, cognitive sciences, mapping our review so we could extract action items. We'll go over the major takes when reviewing the tool in a few moments. The next step was pure fun. We created a 3-axis font for our needs, and we teamed up with Daniel Grumel of Font Type Foundry and his personal project of seeing how he can translate the Nodes cube into Hebrew. To this end, I created a glyph script to create, upon a skeleton input, an output according to the Nodes construction directions. Note that there are two tools that already work on this assumption, but A, they don't really work smoothly on Hebrew that has a flipped contrast to Latin, and B, we wanted to produce all the 8 masters at once. We then went over them, making manual adjustments to have a viable font and fine-tuning the type space. Finally, as in the Nodes cube, the instances that appear at the corners are in fact very similar to the classical Hebrew fonts, which was good for us as we wanted to present familiar typefaces in our set of options. Going back to our action items of the psychology research, we finally sat down to implement our tool. Due to today's time constraints, you'll have to forgive me for skipping to the very last version. So let's look at our visual variable font specimen. First up in the opening screen, we have two things. The first is that there's no default option, meaning that the starting point needs to be selected as well. Second, categories tremendously help to navigate multiple choice options, and in El Jargon, category labels help even more. Let's say, like we used here, a heavy serif and a light sans serif. Selecting one of the options brings us to the main screen. Around the selected starting instance, in the center appear 6 neighboring variations, reachable with different manipulations from the starting instance and from one another. Hovering over any instance reveals its neighboring instances. Zooming in adds the new neighbors to the display and shifts the display towards them. Each new neighbor can be seen as a midway variation between the focused instance and its currently displayed neighbor. Size matters to feeling overwhelmed, and as such, we use common definition of 5 to 7 items being a small, manageable set of visual options. Sequential growing subproblems of side-by-side evaluation helps manage the decision-making. Visually presenting the options side by side allows to less rely on internal reference and more on what is available. Another thing to help navigation is what we gained from implementing the Nodes cube. Our options also include familiar typefaces. Clicking on an instance opens the fine-tuning window that affects the sample text and the serial number before downloading the achieved instance as a regular font file for use. The user can control the amount of resolution with the zooming in, but also with a designated button that reveals all options available. The user can decide to toggle the starting point, switching the middle instance to the opposite option and thus affecting the rest of the instance display. And practical features. As the interface is for expert users, it's equipped with tools that we need for full evaluation of the typeface. So we can type text in, we can set the text size, the kerning, and the leading on the example text using the sliders that appear when we hover over the example text. We can switch the display between black and white. We can change the display title, theoretically typing in a word. So in total, this gives us the option to evaluate the font in 3 levels: the letter, the word, and the text block. Finally, we do note that novices and experts need different tools and also need different displays. But as we chose experts, we neglected a lot of the aspects that might be needed in a regular user setting. A last aspect that I wanted to review is the space display itself. Originally, we wanted to implement a 3D interface, but in practice, displaying our design space in 3D brought too much clutter to the screen and to the interaction to be comfortable workspace. So seeking for ways to display in 2D, we actually went back to the Nodes cube for inspiration. Using a hex grid enabled simultaneously displaying in 2D all the variations that can be directly spanned from a specific instance in a cube coordinate system. Upon each zoom or display shift, we still keep the cube structure, so any subspace is a cube of its own, helping the grasp of space and navigation. Tips and thoughts from the process. I think our initial sketch answers a lot of the problems that we ended up with. So go back and look at your initial and previous versions, constantly asking why the changes happen and are they benefiting the purpose. Second, features are fun. Cleaning up is very nice, and it's nice having a minimalistic interface without any clutter, but users really like features. The third thing is, how do we give instructions without letting the user skip them? A problem we had was that a lot of the users didn't read the welcome screen and just went ahead and clicked, and then they were lost in the main screen. Fourth, zooming in isn't as intuitive as we thought, and clicking isn't as dramatic as we thought. So probably the next version would be a kind of pinning solution. Last thing is the platform, web versus native. We wanted to create a very accessible and live tool, so from the get-go we set off to build a web tool. But from user feedback, we learned that maybe sometimes a thing like an Adobe plugin or a Mac native tool would have been a more intuitive feature for the workflow. I wanted to overview the process so that everybody can benefit towards building better tools for our community. These days, we're also submitting the broader research as a paper that once it's published, it will be linked in the website. We can probably talk for days about parametric design in general, and specifically in graphic design and in the typeface sphere. But for today, I hope you've enjoyed and benefited from the peek into the journey we took and towards your own creations. So thank you.